And welcome everyone tonight to the seventh week of the Genesis seminars. We have three sections tonight. I'll be doing the first and the last one, and John will be doing the second one. And I'm filling in for Chris in a way. I guess he's gone to Thailand, so big shoes to fill tonight. And so we'll get going. So the first section tonight that we're going to look at is entitled A Wife for Jacob. Just get this set up. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 28 and chapter 29. So just before we get into this section and its content, we're just going to do a little bit of background work to set the stage here, set the context for this section. So if we go back to Genesis chapter 25, we'll remember that God gave this prophecy to Rebekah when she was pregnant with the twins. If you recall that Jacob and Esau were twins. And this is what God tells her. He says, two nations are in your womb. Two people shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. So when we look into both of these individuals, they're very different for being twins. And that can be the case sometimes, but particularly with Jacob and Esau, they're very different and they fit into the characteristics that we see throughout the Bible, really, that people are sort of divided into two classes. You have the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And I think everyone in the whole Bible fits into that, into one of those categories. You're either following after the seed of the serpent and the thinking of the serpent, or we fall under the seed of the woman and the thinking of the woman, which is more of a spiritual thinking, and trying to join themselves to God and to the promises that He has for mankind. So when we look at Esau, we recall that his name means hairy or rough, and Esau was the firstborn of the twins. Um, but as John mentioned last week, in this case, God sort of flipped things around a little bit in the case of Esau and Jacob. And so, some of the blessings that normally would have gone by right to the firstborn, it seems to have been flipped around by God in this case of Esau and Jacob. We know that Esau, we're told that he was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. And if you have a Bible with cross references, there's a good cross reference back to Genesis chapter 10, verse 9, that's in regards to Nimrod. And Nimrod fits into this type as well as being a skillful hunter. So obviously somebody who relies on their own strength to make themselves a living, to provide for themselves. We recall also that Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, right? He went out hunting, didn't catch anything, came back. He was like at the point of he was so hungry he thought he was going to die, and so he sells his birthright, thinking that what, I'd rather just live. Um, what value is this birthright if I die, right? So he didn't see any value in spiritual or eternal things. He just lived in the moment. Now, Esau's family becomes the Edomites in the Bible, and you can follow that through scripture. We would say that Esau's characteristics really fit into the seed of the serpent. If you look at them closely, it seems to fit that. Jacob, on the other hand, his name means supplanter. So maybe not off to a good start in terms of what the name means. He was the second born of the twins and came out holding onto his brother's heel. And so his name is very fitting that it means that supplanter. Now, it's also told that Jacob was a plain man, and that may not mean really anything to us. But elsewhere in Scripture, particularly in the book of Job, this word comes up a number of times. And in Job chapter 1, verse 1, we're told that Job was perfect and upright before God. And so this is the same word that's translated plain in Genesis of Jacob that's translated as perfect in Job in reference to him. Jacob dwelled in tents. That's an echo, obviously, to Abraham and the life that he lived. We know that Jacob deceived Isaac with Rebekah to receive the blessing instead of waiting on God. So Jacob's life wasn't perfect, and we'll see that tonight in the sections that we're going to look at. So he's not perfect, but he does listen to spiritual advice. When we look at his characteristics, they align more with the seed of the woman than the seed of the serpent. And Jacob's family becomes the Israelites. And from Jacob and relationships with the women in his life comes the 12 tribes of Israel, and the promises of Abraham follow through Jacob, and that's very easy to follow through in the Bible. And if you haven't during your reading of Genesis, a really good exercise to do is to highlight or Bible mark all the promises that come up through the book of Genesis, and you'll see how they follow through the lives of all these amazing individuals. So, a wife for Jacob. So we read in Genesis chapter 28, verse 1, Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, Thou shalt not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise and go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there to the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. And so Isaac and Rebekah didn't want Jacob to follow the pattern that Esau did in marrying the daughters of the Canaanites around them. They wanted him to travel to this place called Padan Aram to the house of Laban and find a wife that way. So just a little bit of context. We know that by this time Esau had already married Hittite daughters, and we're told at the end of Genesis chapter 26, they were a grief of mind unto Isaac and Rebekah. And so they saw what would happen, and they saw that this influence wouldn't be good in Jacob's life. And so this brings out an important biblical principle, and that is to, when we're seeking relationships or spouses, we need to look for people who have the same ideals, who share the same beliefs, and if we do that, our marriage life will be a lot easier if we're yoked together with someone who believes the same things. And this is a principle that we find throughout Scripture. And I have up on the slide here a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 that says, Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? We may think of the story of Solomon. Solomon was a king of Israel and had all this wisdom, but we know that he married many foreign women, and what happened is they turned his heart away from God. Scripture tells us very explicitly that that's what happened to Solomon in his life, despite all that wisdom, because he married all these foreign women. They turned his heart from God to other gods, and so he's an example of what happens, when the wrong influences are in our lives. They can overpower our spiritual vision. So Isaac blesses Jacob here as he sends him off to find a wife. He says in verse 3, May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be an assembly of peoples, and give you the blessing of Abraham, to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. So Isaac blesses Jacob and sends him on this journey that is not, a 2-day journey. It starts out down at the bottom in the land of Canaan, near Beersheba, and all the way up to the top of our screens there. You can see Haran and Padan Aram. And so that's like, 300, 400 miles. So this is a very long a journey for Jacob to take to find a wife. Esau, on the other hand, we're told that in verse 6, when Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take himself a wife from there, and that he had blessed him and gave him a charge, saying, Thou shalt not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, and that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and had gone to Padan Aram. Also Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan did not please his father Isaac. So Esau went to Ishmael and took Malahath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife in addition to the wives that he had. And so this passage really tells us a lot about Esau. He had already married Hittite um, women, but he goes, once he sees that, Jacob has sent Isaac away um, to find a wife that's not among the daughters of Canaan, he goes again and um, and takes more daughters of Canaan to wife. So just like exact opposite to the spiritual um, lesson that Isaac and Rebekah are trying to teach their kids. So Jacob journeys north, and as he's journeying north towards Haran, we have this interesting story where um, he meets up with an angel, or angels, I should say, in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 12. We read, Now Jacob went out from Beersheba and went unto Haran. So he came to a certain place and stayed there all night, because the sun was set. And he took one of the stones of that place and put it at his head. And he laid down at the place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven. And there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And so we have highlighted there this part here about the angels ascending and descending on this ladder. And the lesson here, I believe, is that it shows to us that the angels are at work in the lives of the faithful, in that they aren't descending and ascending into heaven. They are working on earth and ascending and descending to it. And so we have this cross reference here that I put up from Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, that says, in reference to angels, it says, Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation? So when we think of angels, they're not just beings that are up in heaven looking down at things. They are at work on the earth in the lives of the faithful. And that is true all the way to today, I would say. So here we have the promises again reiterated to Jacob. Genesis 28, verse 13. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and to the south, and in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So we can see all these echoes here to promises that we've already heard in Genesis. Verse 15 says, Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. So that's very important, right? So God is telling Jacob, look, I'm going to be with you, but you're going to come back to this land of Canaan, and I'm going to be with you, and, I'm going to make sure that these promises are fulfilled. You're going to come back, and I'm going to look after you. And why is God saying this to Jacob? Well, because Jacob knows that Esau is out to kill him, basically. Esau is really upset at what happened, at this deception that had taken place between Jacob and Rebekah and Isaac, and taking the blessing away from Esau. And he's really upset about it. And he has said that he basically wants to kill him. So God is telling Jacob that he's going to look after him. So Jacob makes a vow. He takes the stones in verse 18 that he slept on and makes them into a pillar and pours oil on them. He calls the place Bethel, which means the house of God. And Jacob vows that if God is with him, then he will be provided with food and raiment. He will return safely to his father's house. Then the Lord shall be my God. And Jacob vows that he will give to God a tenth of all. Now, when we come to Genesis chapter 29, which basically starts with Jacob arriving in the land of Haran, I've just sort of summarized some of the things that take place here for the sake of time. So, by the hand of providence, Jacob meets Rachel beside a well, and as she came to water her father Laban's sheep, God had prospered Jacob's journey, and he is invited to his uncle's home. Laban has two daughters, Leah and Rachel. Rachel was beautiful, and Jacob falls in love with her, agreeing to serve 7 years for her. At the end of this period, Laban is deceitful, and this time Jacob is the victim. Laban gives Leah to Jacob instead of Rachel, saying the younger should not be given before the elder. Jacob is upset with Laban, understandably, but agrees to serve Laban for another 7 years for Rachel. Just a few more details about Leah and Rachel. So Leah's name means weary, tired, or delicate, and also given to Leah was Zilpah as a handmaid. Rachel's name means a ewe or female sheep, and Rachel was given Bilhah as a handmaid. And so from these four women come the 12 tribes of Israel. And we'll see that later on in the seminar. So this is the beginning of a lot of conflict and strife for Jacob and these four women that are in his life, particularly Rachel and Leah. And so we're told in Genesis chapter 29, verse 31, Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. And so there definitely was favoritism, and Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. And so we read in Genesis chapter 29, verse 31, and when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. So Leah is having all these children and hoping that she gains favor in the sight of Jacob, but it doesn't really work that way. So just in conclusion here, because the next couple chapters are going to be covered by John, I've just thrown up some lessons for us so we can think about in these couple of chapters that we've looked at tonight. One of the things that I thought about was, following God's plan sometimes requires long journeys of faith, much like Jacob had to do in order to find a suitable wife that fit, God's vision, someone that would help him in his spiritual journey. He had to travel this far distance in order to find her. Sometimes following God's plan requires separation from the world and making wise spiritual decisions. And that, goes hand in hand with this journey that Jacob had to do, right? It wasn't fit that he would take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. He went to Laban's household to find one. And that was, he, he had to separate himself from the world in doing so. Number 3, sometimes God's plan takes a long time to work itself out and is full of twists and turns. These all develop faith and teach us to rely on God and not on our own strength and wisdom. And I would say that's true of our own journeys and discipleships in Christ as we await for the kingdom. Sometimes God's plan takes a long time to work itself out, and we just have to trust him. And we'll see that in Jacob's life, he's striving to do this, but it takes time for him to develop this reliance and faith in God. Okay, that's it for me on section 1, and I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Grant. Just share my slides here and I'll get going. Um, so Grant has sort of laid the foundation for this section that I'm going to do, and this idea that this growing family. Um, and my section's called Family Strife, and I would have to say that is an understatement about what we're going to read about um, in this section. I'll just leave it there for a second. So in the 2000s, there's traditional TV as you're going along, sitcoms and dramas and things like that. In the 2000s, we came up against reality TV. I don't know if anyone's experienced watching reality TV, but a certain genre of reality TV was this whole idea of a family reality show. So cameras go into homes and they follow these families and they're just the things they go through on a day-to-day basis. And the goal of it was, I would say, was to find the most dysfunctional families uh, that you could. I'll just ask Deborah that you mute yourself. Um, yeah, they're trying to find the most dysfunctional family so that people will watch. They'll be, glued to their TV. What's going to happen next? Well, I think if Jacob's family lived nowadays, his family, if someone came and pitched, it's called a pitch when you bring an idea. If someone pitched this story, I think the producers would have said, we're looking for reality. This sounds uh, too made up. How can a family go through all these things? So you've got a husband who's running away from a brother who has murderous intentions. So he runs away and he finds this woman he loves. He works for her, he wants to marry her. The father-in-law tricks him into marrying the older daughter first. Then he marries the younger daughter. So you've got these two wives, they're sisters, and then they sort of bring in their maidservants. So now you have a man with basically four wives, and they're all having children. They're all competing for his Jacob's the husband's affection, and they're all competing for children. Meanwhile, the husband works for a father-in-law who's already tricked him once, and now he's ripping him off at work, changing his wages so that he can never get ahead. Um, and so eventually they escape, but in this slow speed chase ensues where the father-in-law comes after them, and the producers would be like, "This can't be true." But that's what we're dealing with in this. We're just going to go through it kind of quickly, but I'll just start with this comment here. A quote, and I couldn't find who said it. It's anonymous, but it says, "Envy is the art of counting another's blessings instead of your own." And that seems to be something that drove uh, this family, envy of other people's blessings instead of just focusing on the things that they had. So if you look in this chart here, here's Leah. And Leah is seeking Jacob's affection. And you can see that if you have your Bibles in Genesis 29, and Grant read this, verse 33 and 34. It says, "She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him three sons." So she's really looking for her husband's affection and she's having all these children, which was a great blessing in those times. But it wasn't about the kids. It was about trying to win Jacob's affection. And then you have Rachel, who is loved. We're told she's loved by Jacob. So she's not interested so much in Jacob's affection. She's desperate for children, um, to the point where she says in chapter 30, verse 1, "Give me some children or else I'll die." And Jacob's anger was aroused, it says. If I could do something, I would. I can't do anything about this situation. Um, so she's desperate for children. Leah's desperate for Jacob's affection. Uh, Jacob resents Leah because he was tricked into marrying her and he wants closer to Rachel, but Rachel's sort of pushing away from him because she just simply wants to have kids. And so you've got this real messed up dynamic that's going on in this family. Um, and then we know that Leah and Rachel turn on each other. They're sisters, but they turn on each other because they have this envy of the situation each other is in. And we see that in 30 verse 8, where it says, Then Rachel said, With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. Rachel eventually gives her servant to Jacob, uh, has this son Naphtali, and so she's like, okay, finally, a child. Um, and here we can see the children that this chart's kind of nice. You can see Leah had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And it's not in this order necessarily. We'll see that in a second. She gives Zilpah, she stops having kids for a little bit, so she gives Zilpah to Jacob. She has Gad and Asher. And that's another dynamic. How do these two women, Zilpah and Bilhah, feel about this whole situation? They're having kids, but the Leah and Rachel are claiming them as their own. What a horrible situation to be in some aspects. Bilhah has Dan and Naphtali, and eventually Rachel has Joseph and Benjamin. And so here's the order of birth that we see. So Leah has these four here, and then Bilhah has these two. Uh, Zilpah has these two, and then Leah has a couple more, and then Rachel finally at the end, just when you think it's not possible anymore, she has Joseph and Benjamin. And just all the names are important because they make up the tribes of Israel, but just some important things. Levi becomes the tribe of priests. They're the ones that work in the tabernacle. Judah is actually the lineage of Jesus. Now, I remember as a young person reading the Bible and being finally waking up to this fact that it was through Judah that's the line of Jesus, because I would have naturally assumed it was Joseph, because the rest of Genesis is pretty much about Joseph, and we're going to cover him next week. But so, and there's some really nice Bible study you can do about Judah and his development as a character. So there's that chart. So there's wrestlings, there's conflict, there's envy within the family, between the wives, definitely between the children as they say, hey, my mom's not being loved and your mom's loved, and there's conflict, and we'll see that, as I mentioned, next week. But there's also family strife with Laban, the father-in-law. So in chapter 30 and 31, we read about Jacob in his relationship at his job, and his boss is his father-in-law. And just to point out some of the difficulties that he's going through. In verse 31 and 32, so Jacob says in verse 31, so he said, Laban says, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. So Jacob's sort of saying, I would like to leave. I'd like to start my family away from you, start my own business, with sheep. And Laban's like, no, stay. I can tell that God's blessed you. Please stay. And Jacob says, you don't have to give me anything. He says, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep and all the brown ones among the lambs and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So I'll go through the flock, and anything that is sort of, I would assume you want the pure ones, all white. And Jacob says, I'll just take the ones that are speckled, spotted, brown, the ones you don't want. I will take them. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When you subject my wages comes before you. When the subject of my wages comes before you, sorry. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. So if any of these lambs, goats, have anything that isn't speckled, spotted, brown, you have it. I'm not taking those. And so Laban says in verse 35, he says, verse 34, oh, that it were according to your word. So he's like, fine, sounds like a great idea. And then we see the deception of Laban. What does Laban do in verse 35 through 36? He goes through and grabs, before Jacob gets a chance, all the speckled, spotted, brown sheep and lambs and moves them 3 days away. So he's basically saying, yeah, Jacob, this is a great plan. And secretly, I'm leaving you with nothing to start with. Um, and so that's the kind of person that Laban is and that Jacob's working for. In fact, later on, we'll read that Jacob says, you've changed my wages 10 times. It's this idea of these moving goalposts. Okay, there's my target. That's what I have to do. And he goes and does it, and then Laban changes it, and everything's upside down again. Just brutal behavior. And, a union would step in very quickly, or you know, the government labor industry. So, uh, but the thing is that God is blessing Jacob with great success through all of this. Um, Jacob is doing this thing with these rods, and you read about in verses 37 through 43. But I just want to point out um, verse 41, and it came to pass whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. So he's saying when the strong livestock gave birth, they gave birth to spotted, speckled, and brown. But when the flocks were feeble, they gave birth to just the clean ones. So Laban's getting all the weak stuff, and Jacob's getting all the strong stuff. So God is got his fingers in this. He's blessing Jacob. Um, in verse 31 or chapter 31, verse 1, it says, now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has acquired all this wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable to him as before. Um, and later on, let's see, in verse 7, it says, yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. Verse 9, so God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. So Jacob is very understanding that God is behind this. God is blessing him. No matter how bad Laban is, God is taking care of Jacob. Um, but it gets to a point where Jacob's like, we just have to leave. We have to get out of here. And here, once again, and we've seen this a couple times now, this mini Exodus, sort of pointing forward to what we'll read in the book of Exodus. So, verse 1 and 2, we read that Laban has a change of heart. And we just read that. Jacob heard his brothers in law saying, Jacob has taken everything we had. And there's this change of heart. Laban's getting angrier and angrier at Jacob's success. Oops, I have these in the wrong order. First of all, Jacob went for refuge in Haran, just like Jacob's family finds refuge in Egypt. Laban has a change of heart, just like Pharaoh will have a change of heart towards the Israelites. At first, they're happy that they're there, but later they're like, oh, if these Israelites keep growing, they're going to conquer us. Laban is basically oppressing Jacob by changing his wages over and over. And we know that there was oppression of the Israelites when they were in Egypt. Despite this oppression, God makes them prosper. And God's making Jacob prosper, and he made the Israelites prosper, even when they were trying to kill all the firstborn males or all the males of the Israelites. God was blessing them because they were hiding these babies, and it made Pharaoh even more afraid. And then eventually God told Jacob in verse 3 of 31, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. Eventually, they're told, go back to your land. The same thing happens with the Israelites. Moses is sent. It is time to come out of Egypt and go back to their land. And in verse, we know that Jacob flees with great possessions. In verse 21, it says, so he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the river and headed toward the mountains of Gilead. And we know the Exodus, that the Israelites, the Egyptians were so filled with sorrow, they were like, take whatever you want, just get out of here. And they left with great possessions. So we see this echo, this same pattern happening. And eventually, uh, Jacob is pursued by Laban, but Laban is told, you better not say, by an angel, you better not say anything bad about him, or you will deal with the consequences. It says in verse 24, but God had come to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. And we know that even though the Israelites were pursued by Pharaoh and his army, they were unable to catch them when they crossed the Red Sea. They were saved by the Lord. So, just a question as we come towards the end of this section. Why all these Exodus stories? We have just in Genesis, we have Noah in the ark, sort of an exodus from that old world. He's pulled out and saved in that ark. We have Lot coming out of Sodom and Gomorrah, an exodus from those cities. We have Abraham being called out of Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham was in Egypt as well, and he comes out of Egypt. We have Jacob right now coming out of Haran and Padan Aram. That's where he was with Laban. And eventually we'll have Israel out of Egypt. Why all these Exodus stories of people of the seed of the woman coming out? And I think it's all pointing forward, and it's a message to us. In 1 Peter 2, verse 9, it says, but you are a chosen nation, a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So each one of us, when we read the Bible, when we read these stories, we have to remember we're being called to be different, to come out. That's the end of my section, but and I know Grant's going to have this in his summary slides. Um, I'll just stop this, but just before you take over, Grant, some things we can learn from that section. Humans are dysfunctional. Jacob's family with his wives and the maidservants and the children, God's not saying, hey, this is how you're supposed to live. It's not I heard a saying, it's not a prescription, it's just a description. This is a description of a dysfunctional family, a human family. They're not perfect. But because they're not perfect, it speaks to us. God was still working with them. And from that, we see that God's compassionate. He was compassionate to Leah in her situation. She didn't have Jacob's love, so he gave her children. He was compassionate to Rachel. She couldn't have children, and eventually he saw her sorrow and he gave her children. And he was compassionate to Jacob. He got him out and away from Laban. And so we also learn God's faithful and he has a covenant relationship, that he's not going anywhere. It's so comforting to know that our God does not change. He is always in the same place, always the same character, and we can always turn to him. So I'll end there, Grant, and let you finish it up.
Okay, thanks, John, for that very interesting section there. And so we're going to continue on in the story of Jacob. And section 3 tonight, we're going to look at Jacob and Esau meeting. So, as John's already told us, Jacob reaches a point in his time in Haran that he decides, hey, we got to get out of here. We're going to leave, and he's going to go back to Canaan. And this was, set up in God's God's plan. God did not intend on Jacob going up into that area of the world, into Haran, and staying there forever or anything like that. He wanted Jacob to return because Canaan was the land of promise. It was where um, it was the location where the promises that God gave to Abraham um, meant something. So we're going to look at Genesis 32 and 33 tonight, and it's kind of like Jacob preparing to meet Esau, and then what happens when they finally do meet. So just a little bit of review and context before we look at this. I mentioned this earlier in the first section, um, you know, that in the back of Jacob's mind when he was returning to Canaan, he knew that what this meant was facing Esau. And so I've heard that it's probably about 20 years has taken place here between when Jacob left Canaan and now he's returning. So it's somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't have any proof of that, but it's somewhere around 20 years. And so we just remember what the circumstances were like when Jacob left, right? Esau was very upset and intended to kill his brother Jacob, as we read in Genesis chapter 27. So Jacob knew that. Um, but right off the bat, when we read Genesis chapter 32, we read in verse 1, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And so you could see this is God's plan, and God is trying to support Jacob as much as possible to follow through with bringing his family back down into the land of Canaan. And without a doubt, I think Jacob would have been worrying about this day the whole time he was up in Haran. I think this would have been something that he dreamt about. It was always this problem in the back of his mind that he thought, like, someday I'm going to have to confront this face to face. He knew that he would have to return, and here it is. And so God was helping him in this situation to support him and to help his faith follow through with going back to the land of Canaan. And and here's a good cross reference back to Genesis chapter 28, verse 15. God says, "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you." So Jacob already had that promise. God said, "I'm going to be with you the whole time, and I'm not going to leave you or forsake you." Even though God had said that to Jacob, he still needed all this reinforcement from God. And, we're no different in our own lives. And often we face stressful situations and we're trying to trust God, but it's just like it's the weight of the matter is crushing on us. And it's hard to devote ourselves 100% to trusting God. And that's what happens in the life of Jacob. So, just sort of in a summary, just for the sake of time, I've gone through a part of Genesis chapter 32 and summarized it. So, Jacob and his family continue their journey back to Canaan. He sends a message ahead to Esau with his servants, so he's kind of like testing the water in verse 6. He finds out that his brother Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. And so he obviously was probably quite taken back at that his brother, had this great group of men and was coming to meet him. And so we read in verse 7 that Jacob is greatly afraid and distressed because he knows he has to face his brother Esau and he doesn't know what his intentions are. Okay. So Jacob makes a plan. Jacob makes this plan to meet Esau, and so he does whatever is humanly possible that's within his power to control, to do his best to approach this situation and alleviate the stress or give him the best odds of surviving. I mean, the last time he saw Esau wanted to kill him, right? So these things are all playing out in Jacob's mind as he plans to meet Esau. So he divides his family into two groups with the flocks and herds. And his thinking is that if Esau attacks the one group, then the other one can escape. He sends presents to Esau the day before his arrival to pacify him: 200 goats, 200 sheep, 20 rams, 30 cattle, 10 bulls, 20 donkeys, and 10 foals. Like, this is like, a huge amount of of money, if you will, or possessions, and sending all these animals to Esau. So he's doing whatever he humanly can to set up himself and his family for success in meeting Esau and to pacify Esau. But he really doesn't know what's going to happen. But then he prays to God for help. And this is such an important part of anyone who is struggling with stressful things in life is to seek God in prayer and, lay it out before him, what your problem is and how you feel about it. And so we have this prayer recorded in verse 9 to 12. And Jacob says, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come back and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. So he lays his problem out to God in prayer, and also is like reminding God about some of these promises that God has made to him in the past, which I thought was quite interesting as well. So he's praying to God for help, and so should we daily, and particularly when we're facing stressful situations. So we read later on in Genesis chapter 32 that night Jacob got up and took his two wives, his two female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. Now, obviously, we know from reading this passage that it's an angel. So the story continues, but Jacob replies, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And the man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask me my name? And he blessed them there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. This is sort of a strange story, I think. Jacob grabs hold of this angel and wrestles with him. It's really, there's no other place in the Bible that I can think of story like this. But Jacob is really after a blessing from God in this circumstance, and he's coming to realize that all these plans that he has made, you know, really they're nothing if he doesn't have God's blessing. They're going to fall as human plans often do. So Jacob name is changed to Israel here. And so this also is a pretty big turning point in Jacob's life. So we're taught a few lessons out of this story, one being that divine blessings come to those who persistently seek God. And we can think of, what Jacob does here in this story. He grabs hold of the angel and he's not going to let go. He is not going to let go until he receives this blessing from him. And sometimes we have to have that same enthusiasm in our own spiritual lives and working out the problems and issues of our own lives, have that same persistence. Jacob has learned to trust God and not to rely on his own strength or wisdom or making all these plans and how he's going to pacify Esau. In the end, I think he just came to realize that he really needed God to work this situation out, and all these other plans that he made up, God just could, or Esau could have just simply dismissed them. Now, we remember that Jacob's name means supplanter or someone who takes another's place by deceit. And so this is you know, really gives us the idea of someone who will just work at their problems with human planning, right? And we can see in Jacob's life that he's learning to trust God more and and himself less. So now his name is changed to Israel, which means a prince with God. And it really shows this change that's happening in Jacob's life, that he's learning to trust God and that God will work these matters out. Now, when we just think about this situation, so the angel has touched his hip and sort of put it out of joint, if you will. And so Jacob still has to meet Esau, and he's crippled. So he's not in any sort of shape for any physical confrontation with Esau. And so really the situation is is worse in a physical way. But it's the right moment for God to show his salvation and working out this circumstance and this difficult trial in Jacob's life and meeting Esau and not knowing what was going to happen. But once again, Jacob is being taught to rely on God and not on his own strength and wisdom. And God is showing him, look, I'm in control. I told you I was going to look after you and bring you back to this land and have all these promises fulfilled to you. You need to just trust me. And so at the very end, God just laid all of this bare in Jacob's eyes, that there was nothing left but to trust in God that he would work these things out. And so we read in Genesis 33, verse 1, now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming with him, and with him were 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants, and he put the maidservants and their children in front, Leah and her children behind, and Jake and Rachel and Joseph last. Then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And so this big meeting happens. Jacob has been waiting for this for years, and probably Esau as well. And Jacob has been waiting with great trepidation and fear of what would happen. Is Esau going to kill me? Are they going to attack my family? Are they going to kill us all? And instead, we can see God is in control and has worked all these things out in this time period. And Esau and Jacob meet and they embrace each other, and it's this great emotional outpouring towards each other, and they kiss each other and they weep. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, who are these with you? And Jacob says, the children whom God hath graciously given your servant. Then the maidservants came near, they and their children, and bowed down. And Leah also came near with her children, and they bowed down. Afterward, Joseph and Rachel came near, and they bowed down. And so God resolves this stressful situation for Jacob. So it's a great lesson here for us as well, that we have to develop this faith that Jacob had to develop in his own life, to simply put our trust in God um, when it's needed in our lives, and we're facing difficult situations, stressful situations. And I'm sure we've all had to deal with them before, where we're dealing with circumstances that are just crushing in terms of the complexity of them. And they may not feel like it afterwards or in years after and things like that, but during the time when you're going through them, you can hardly go through your daily activities because they're so stressful. And certainly this was one of those times in Jacob's life. So Jacob comes to Canaan and fulfills um, God's plan for him and his family. You read in Genesis 33, verse 17, then Jacob came safely to the land of Shechem, which is the land of Canaan, and when he came from Padan Aram, and he pitched his tent before the city, and he bought the parcel of land where he had pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of silver. Then he erected an altar there and called it El Eloi Israel, which means God the God of Israel. So just in conclusion and in summary, just some lessons for us that we can take from what we've looked at from tonight. The first thing that I thought of is, or it's actually the first three here are written in the workbook, so I just kind of copied them out and stuck them in here. So in fear, Jacob fled from Esau, and God comforted him and promised to be with him. He is with all those who serve him. And there's this passage here that I have up on the screen from Hebrews 13, verse 5, where God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so we can take that to heart as well in our own lives when facing difficult circumstances, that God is with all those who serve him and fear him. Number two, Jacob had deceived his father to obtain the blessing, but he became in turn the victim of deceit from Laban. And it sort of goes to this, some of the passages in the Bible that talk about like you reap what you sow. And so, careful how you behave yourself because you might be subject to the same sorts of things later on in your own life. Number three, Jacob feared Esau's approach with 400 men, but the angel who wrestled with him taught him to rely on God and not the flesh. And here, these last three were given to me by John. We've included them here in conclusion. Number four, humans are dysfunctional, and we can see that, in the relationships and in this family that Jacob had with the four women and the children. It was dysfunctional, and even in the relationship with his brother Esau and his father and Rebecca. These are dysfunctional relationships, and our families are really probably no different. We struggle with these things and struggle with personalities and characteristics and issues that we face in our day-to-day lives. And so, we can look at these examples in the Bible and realize that, hey, um, those families had to go through the same sorts of things, but God worked through them and helped them. Number five, God is compassionate, right? So God was compassionate to Leah, was compassionate to Rachel, he was compassionate to Jacob as well in his overcoming his fear and in meeting up with his brother Esau once again. We know that God is faithful and never changes, and we can see that right through all the support that God gave to Jacob in his life to help him, along his journey and travels to support his faith in realizing that, following God's plan and purpose was first and foremost in his life, and that God would be with him to the very end to bring him back to the land of Canaan and support him through that. All right, so that brings tonight's seminar to a close. I'll just stop recording.